Before I really get into the sermon, I do want to make a comment on the reading from Job. Job is a wonderful, righteous man, full of integrity, also kind of a misogynist. Just keep that in mind. Anyway. Foolish women? I don't know. Anyway. So, when I graduated high school, so the high school I went to, which was in Indiana, Southport High School, their team mascot is a cardinal, like the bird, not the person who works for the Pope. And our school colors were red and white, kind of like St. Mark's here. And when we graduated, we wore red and white, graduation regalia. The boys wore red and the girls wore white. And generally what we did is when we processed at graduation, they processed kind of like Noah's Ark, right? Like one male and one female, red and white going up. And I was at the front of the line, so I don't really remember. I'm sure we didn't have an even mix of men and women. So I don't know how the extras were handled, but anyway, red and white, we walked up. And it had been the tradition at my high school for many, many, many years. My brothers and sisters who are much older than me, they remembered this, that seniors were allowed to choose who they walked with. Right, so if you were like me and you had a girlfriend or someone you really wished was your girlfriend, more to the point, that you could walk up together, right? And it was one of those things that people looked forward to. It was sort of a wonderful celebration, the culmination of our years of school and our time at the high school. But the year I was graduating, about 2 weeks before graduation, the administration school announced that we would no longer be allowed to choose who we walked with at graduation. And they had a reason for that, because the year I started high school was the year that we began desegregation of the schools in Indianapolis. They weren't legally segregated like in the South in the 50s, but they had become segregated through sort of, redlining and people living in different neighborhoods and so on and so forth. And so when I started high school was the year they started busing, and so people were moving around all over the city. And the high school that I went to was going to be the first school to hold a graduation ceremony since the beginning, because when they started busing, it was only the freshmen. So the sophomore class, the junior class, and the senior class didn't have students who were coming from other communities. It was just our freshman class. So our class was the first class to graduate with an integrated school body. And the school administration was concerned because it was the first school to graduate. They anticipated there would be a lot of media attention. So newspapers were going to be there, and their photographers and TV crews were going to come to our graduation, and they came to I remember they even came to our graduation rehearsal. And so the administration was concerned because the reality of desegregation wasn't some kind of kumbaya, diverse community. It was actually a community that was still pretty divided. That if you walked into our cafeteria at lunchtime, you would find most of the white kids over there and most of the people of color over there. There had been some mingling in some of the sports teams and in the band, but by and large, it just hadn't worked out the way that I think everybody had hoped to that point. So the administration was concerned because they didn't want to show that this project wasn't working the way they had hoped. They didn't want to have a graduation that looked like two wholly separate communities in the same space. And so we had sort of like a little mini student protest movement, I guess. And we did end up walking with the people we wanted to walk with. And I don't remember how they worked all that out, but that's I did get to walk with Julie. Anyway, still my best friend. Anyway, and I can kind of understand where they were coming from, because the administration was truly committed to this vision of a diverse community, a place where all of us were lifted up by being in contact with people who weren't exactly like us, where we could expand our minds and our experiences, where we could become more fully the people that we were always meant to be. And there just hadn't been enough time 4 years was just not enough time to integrate these communities. I expected, and I've seen subsequently, because they still do this, the same program is still in place, and the school I went to is this wonderfully diverse student body, and I've seen it, and it's amazing how 40 years have changed things. But after 4 years, things hadn't really changed yet, right? And my problem is I'm something of an idealist, which is really, I wouldn't recommend it to anyone. It mostly makes you grumpy all the time, because I don't know if you've noticed, but the world is not very ideal most of the time. So it's just don't be an idealist, it's just the path to being a curmudgeon. Right, Dave? We're like kindred spirits, Dave and I. And I can see recognition in his eyes. And so, as an idealist, I was put out, partly I was motivated because I wanted what I wanted, this tradition that we had always had and that was important to us. At the same time, I also felt like they were trying to tell a lie. They were trying to show something that wasn't true by upending all of our expectations to present this picture of an integrated community that did not yet exist. And partly they did it because they were truly committed to that vision. And they didn't want the people who would see it in the news, otherwise known as the taxpayers, to see that this somewhat expensive project wasn't working. They didn't want to give people the ammunition to say, well, this is a waste of time. Because it wasn't a waste of time, but there hadn't been enough time yet, and people have such short attention spans. And so as Christian people, I run into this a lot, that the difference between sort of the ideal and the truth are sometimes far apart. And as Christian people, we're called to live as though the ideal were true now. We're called to live in the heavenly city here today, to act as though the world is as it should be. But at the same time, we can't pretend that the world as it is doesn't exist. Right? If we are people of integrity, then we need to be people who look at the reality of the world and see the gap between it and do what we can to close that distance. Right? And this is one of the real struggles, I think, of faith. Right? Because all of us probably know the phrase that don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Right? Which is to say that if we want to make forward progress, we're not going to get everywhere we want to go all at once. That sometimes it takes time. Right? And Jesus came 2,000 years ago to offer this very compelling vision of what life could be like. And we have made amazing progress. That the world we live in, despite its troubles, is immeasurably better than life in the Roman Empire. That we live in a society that is much more fair, that is much more equal, that provides much more opportunity than the one that Jesus knew. But it isn't fully equal, and it doesn't provide everyone opportunity. Not everyone gets to experience dignity. And so as Christian people, it's important for us to always keep our eye on the vision that Jesus offers us of how the world should be, how the world was made to be. And one of our goals as Christian people is to work to imbue the world with the goodness with which God created it at the beginning. And so as Christian people, we are constantly in this tension of what are we willing to compromise in order to make some progress. And that's a tough spot to be in. How do we maintain our commitment? How do we maintain our faith? How do we maintain our integrity as followers of Jesus in a broken and fallen world? Right? And this gospel story today is kind because pointing to that importance of keeping our eye on the prize. Because here's this story that Jesus, he's just done, in the Gospel of Mark, there are two feeding stories, the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. And they both kind of work the same way. They're out in the middle of nowhere. Thousands of people show up. It's dinner time. There's no food. They find a couple of loaves of bread and maybe a fish or two. And somehow it turns into enough food for everybody. In fact, it turns into not just enough food for everybody, but it's such an abundance of food that there is an amazing amount left over. And this is really about the power of faith to change the world. And so they're getting in the boat. And Jesus just had this confrontation with the Pharisees who are going like, can you prove to us that you're the Son of God? Can you give us some kind of sign that we know for sure, for a certain 100% that you are the Son of God? And Jesus is like, no, just like look around you guys. You can see what's going on. Like, trust your eyes. And so then they get in the boat and they're going across the sea back home, and Jesus tells them, you guys got to be careful of the blindness of the Pharisees, right? He calls it the yeast. But what he's talking about is that don't let their ideas infect you and change your hearts. Don't let the world get you down. And they're like, oh, he's mad because we didn't bring any bread. And Jesus is like, I'm not mad because you didn't bring any bread, you dolts. Like, it's a metaphor. Like, pick up the clues here, guys. Because like the disciples, they just don't quite get it in this story. So Jesus is, I think, rightfully frustrated with them. And I think all of us have had this experience, especially if we've had children, right? And that, like, why don't you just, like, get it? And so Jesus is trying to open their eyes to the vision, the possibility of what God offers, but also reminding them, or at least trying to show them, that we can't lose heart because the world isn't perfect, that it doesn't conform with our vision and understanding of what God wants, and that there are compromises that we have to live into if we are ever to make any progress at all. But even as we make compromises, we need to stay true to who we are and whose we are. That the compromises we make can't go against the gospel that we're trying to live out and enact. That it's okay to understand that the world is broken, that there is evil, and that we need to stand up for that evil. And that sometimes we have to make some compromise in order that we can get some good. But we need to continue the effort to get all of the good. That the way stations on the travel, on the journey, aren't our final destination. That we as Christian people are marching into a future that God has ordained for us. And that we are co-creators almost with God in creating a society that resembles something like the vision that Jesus offers us. So as we walk through this world, I would encourage all of us to remind ourselves, which is what the disciplines of faith are about reminding ourselves about what we've been called to by God, about this glorious and amazing mission that we've been given to build the heavenly city in our own lives and in the lives of those around us. And never lose sight of that vision. And never get dispirited that the ideal doesn't match reality. Confidence in the promise that through our efforts and through the work of Jesus Christ, that heaven and earth will one day be one. Amen.